Hello everyone, this is RaySpace and welcome back to Realism Overhaul Sandbox and Kerbal Space Program 1.12. In the previous video, I sent the Goku Lunar Lander over to the moon with this modified upper stage for SLS Block II. It has 6 RL-10s instead of 4 and is basically 1.5 times the size of the regular EUS upper stage. But that raises the question, what would be the optimal upper stage for SLS Block II? If it's not going to be EUS, since I decided I needed more. I've underutilized this tank in order to give it some margin because I've decided not to have two separate tanks. We're going to have the hydrogen and oxygen both in this one container, this one cylinder, so that I can resize it with ease instead of having to resize two different bits. And so, yeah, I underutilized it to make it a little bit more fair. In fact, it might be even more margin than I need. And the first attempt is going to be one that I know is not correct, but I'm trying to maximize the delta V number in the dialog up there in the delta V stats. So I'm trying to get the largest amount of total delta V just by resizing this stage. And we get a freakishly huge stage as a result of this. We peak out at 13,990 meters per second, but we end up with a stage with a 1 hour and 4 minute burn time. So that's no good. I decided to slap on 4 BE3Us on there instead so that we have enough thrust and less burn time. That gives us 12-minute burn time. Since the BE3Us are less efficient than the RL-10s, we resize the stage so that it's smaller in order to get the peak amount to delta V, so that helps a little bit as well, but it's still not going to work, which it leads us to the conclusion that just looking at that delta V number is not a good idea. We're going to see very quickly that this is just not good enough, and that's because of the thrust-to-weight ratio once the boosters go off. I mean, it can lift off and everything, right? But once the boosters go off, we have a really bad thrust-to-weight ratio, and that's going to be a problem. You can see that whereas before we used to be pitching below prograde with ascent guidance with the videos recently, in this case we're pitching above ascent guidance at 60 degrees because it already knows that this is going to be a bad situation. And right there, once the boosters go off, we are barely accelerating at all. We eventually do pick up once we burn off some of the fuel, but it's not good. It's still holding 60 degrees way above the prograde vector, and I decided to revert because we didn't have enough to transfer over to the moon. So I need to resize this, and if I just reduce the delta V, the total delta V, by 50, from 13,550 to 13,500, that cuts out more than 2 minutes of burn time in the stage, because it's not giving that much of a marginal benefit. And then our thrust-weight ratio on both bits is 0.81, so that's better. Let's see how that works out, and whether we can get to orbit with enough delta V to transfer the payload over to the moon at least. Of course, in the previous video with the Goku Lander with the stage that I used, which was 1.5 times the size of EUS with 6 RL-10s, that one was able to get to orbit with this lander with 3,800 meters per second, between 3,800 and 3,900. As the boosters go off, we're still pitching higher than the prograde vector, but it's only to 45 degrees, so not as bad. We are still accelerating there, and once the first stage is done, we can see that what the ascent guidance dialog is saying is that we're going to end up with 3,823, well now 3,816. And here we are completing orbit with these 4 BE3Us. And we end up with 3,857, so about the same as in the previous video with the 1.5 times sized upper stage. But can we get better if we reduce the stage? So I cut out another 100 meters per second and see if that's any better. So we are reducing the total delta V in the dialog in order to gain thrust-weight ratio in order to see where we get the sweet spot. Since I just got about the same amount that I did with the 1.5 times EUS upper stage I used in the previous video, we know that the sweet spot lies between what we have here and that. So it's at least a 50% increase to the size of EUS, and probably more than that, but probably less than what we had last time. So somewhere in the middle there, we'll find our answer. So here the core runs out, and we see that we're expecting about 4,000 left over, as opposed to 3,857, I think it was last time. And we end with 4,047, so much better, about 200 meters per second better than last time. We're on the right track, but do I want to keep launching in little increments the whole time? Well, there is another principle that we could apply. Previously, I had introduced the idea that the optimal amount of delta V from a stage is its exhaust velocity, which is about 10 times the ISP. So we would be expecting 4,530 from the core and then 4,400-ish from the upper stage. But of course, we can get more delta V out of them, and we need more delta V out of them. The other principle is that the two stages, if they have about the same ISP, should be giving about the same delta V. And so I resized the upper stage so it's giving a little bit more like the delta V that it should be giving considering its ISP, which is a little bit less than the core gets. And since we have resized it, I also decide that we only need 2 BE3Us because having 4 was giving us too much thrust to weight ratio there, and this will make it lighter. So that is a little bit closer to the optimal. And now this stage is approximately 2 times the size of EUS. So we have that as our benchmark for now. And off it goes. So does it get better than the last time where we got 4,047? I'm using this consistent payload, the Goku lander, so that we can compare. And then after this, I will do a launch to see what the maximum payload to the moon would be. So off go the boosters, and at this point it says 4,013, which is not great. But then it flicks to 4,125 sometimes, so even I don't know, while launching this, what it's going to end up at. Core stage goes off, and here we have the 2 BE3Us once again. So, you know, basically the upper stage of New Glenn is pretty good. We really ought to use that. If only it was 8.4 meters, it'd be great on top of SLS, really. So we end up with just a little bit more. 4,065, 4,066. So I didn't think there was too much more tweaking to do in this area. The best thing we can do is switch back to the RL10s because they have more efficiency, and I decided actually to go with 8 instead of 9, and that's mainly because of the node on the interstage on the core stage there, because otherwise I would have to shift things around in an unpleasant way. So 8 RL10, so essentially we have a double EUS is what we've got. What are the downsides? Well, of course, cost. You're going to have double the engines. That's unpleasant, and that's probably why they didn't do it. The question you have to face is whether making this larger stage is worthwhile given the amount of extra payload capacity that you get out of it. So off go the boosters. You can see we're aimed right at the appropriate vector there, which is nice. And we're hoping that the RL10s will give us better capability than the BE3Us. They ought to. They do have this extra burn time, basically double the burn time that the BE3U pair had. We could do with a different kind of engine, 1 or 2 larger engines that have good efficiency with a big nozzle. But anyway, this is what we have right now. 4,113, so definitely better than last time. So we can go with this. Let's see what the payload capacity to the moon would be. Now, I'm using the RL10s here, but there was a comment about a engine from Sierra Space. Plain text 384 mentioned engine from Sierra Space that gets even better ISP, 465, and has a bit more thrust. As you see me adding the RCS here. I didn't put the RCS earlier, but of course, for payload tests to the moon, we really ought to have the RCS as well. I just made hydrazine RCS, which is what it ought to have. And off we go. So yeah, we can take a look at those engines once I configure some engines to be like that engine, which is the VR35K-A engine from Sierra Space. I need to actually make that engine. There are no pictures of the full engine, so I don't know what it actually looks like. I'm just gonna configure something to be sort of like it and see what happens, and then we'll see what the benefit of that engine would be. But for now, we have the 8 RL10s here, and with the boosters off, we see that we're aimed a little bit higher than the prograde vector. We're trying to lift 64 tons to the moon. That's the goal right now. It's a 64-ton avgas tank. The Goku lunar lander was a little bit more than 50 tons. And here we are making orbit, and what you see is probably too little for a lunar transfer. I wouldn't want just 3,057, which is what we have. We want more like 3,150. So I reduced the payload to 62 tons, so just 2 tons less, and see if we can make that up. I judged from the delta V reading there. So I wanted about 100 more, and it looks like reducing the payload by 2 tons would give me 100 more. That's not much margin for NASA stuff. So we would probably shade it by another 2 tons for NASA purposes to give them that kind of margin. That'd be about 3% margin. So here we're launching 62 tons, we could say 60 tons. And yes, this one is going to work. It'll give me the 3,150 meters per second. So 60 tons. Is it worth it? Is it worth paying for double the engines in order to get 12 extra tons of capacity to the moon? That's the question. It is of interest that the stage that we do currently have for SLS Block II, the EUS, is not an optimal stage for the rocket, but we see that given the engine choices that they had, they weren't going to get a reasonable stage that could really optimize the payload capacity to the moon, considering we need 8 RL-10s here. And then the other choice was potentially the J2X. The J2X is much, much heavier than these 8 RL-10s. These combined are about 1 ton. The J2X is more than 3 tons, so that's a lot of extra dry mass. And it's not as efficient as the RL-10s. They are at 460 seconds of ISP. The J2X, I think, was 446 or something like that. So it's a little bit better than the BE3Us. So, yeah, that is the result. Is this perfectly optimized? No, I'm sure we could tweak it a little bit here and there, but we're getting, you know, maybe within a dozen meters per second of the best. So there you have it, 62 tons with enough to transfer it to the moon. And with that, I'll say thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please do press like. If you have any comments or suggestions, please leave them in the comment section below, and I'll see you next time.